welcome back. We'll continue to try and get Gowrie in here, but we're talking open source. The world was hit with a massive vulnerability at Log4j, and what sparked the entire conversation and a little bit of hilarity between all of us was when we got a comment to one of my videos was, all of this would have been prevented if Log4j was open source. To which I just looked at Gowrie and said, are you going to tell him or am I going to tell him? Log4j, it is open source, and it didn't prevent it, which sparked an entire debate between me, Gowrie. Gator started losing his mind, and we decided we should absolutely have this discussion among all of us so you can enjoy Gator losing his mind among all of us. Because the truth is I don't know if open source has some warts. I'm going to go ahead. I'll let Gowrie back in here. Assign him there. But it has some warts. Open source has some major benefits. It has some major problems. And we're going to talk through them on this live stream right now. So, Gowrie, welcome back. Do you think you have everything set up now, maybe?
Yeah,
zoomed
let
in
me get the
on
camera
your
on me. I think well enough. You guys can hear me okay?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Yes, we can hear you.
So, Gator, is there anything I missed as far as that introduction that you want to cover? And I'll set the stage a little bit more.
So, I'm going to be interested to see how we go through with this entire situation. The setup is the pros and the cons and the uglies of open source. Are we just concerning Log4j? Are we talking about everything is the next thing, Silk?
I think we can talk about a little bit of everything when it comes to open source. I mean, like, the truth is this vulnerability was injected into Log4j like in 2012, 2013. It's been there for almost like 7 years.
It's been a while.
And it was reviewed, it was approved, it was merged in, and then it was like later in like 2016 that someone actually kind of stumbled on this issue where they had not really stumbled on it, but there was a feature to kind of be able to say, hey, we need to be able to turn this off because of the bug they found. So I think we start with Log4j in a little bit of like, one of the biggest things we hear about open source all the time is it has everyone's eyes can look at the code. It's open source. Anyone can review the source code. There's tons of eyes on it. And with a package which has been installed, 26.3 million times in the past 3 months? Like, doesn't that mean that this should have one of the top 300 packages? I think it was like 251 by popular download. Like, this, by all means, should be the poster child for open source.
All right, so I'm going to let you in on a dirty little secret. Open source is great, and everybody assumes that everybody else is looking at all the packages that are out there in the open. Open source is free as in beer. Meaning, hey, Silk, I want to buy you a beer. You didn't pay for the beer, but you got a free beer. Guess what? I still had to go through and pay for that. The same idea comes with every single open source package that's out there. If there is nobody willing to be able to go through and not only back it, but fund it, not just temporarily, but for long term, sure, with open source, you have the ability. Everybody has the ability to go check that source. Are you an expert in source code and being able to find out if there are vulnerabilities written? And the answer is, most of the time, the answer to that is no. So then you need to hire a third party to come in and be able to do that. Much like what we've talked about Bitwarden going through and doing. Much like what we've talked about when it comes to different projects from the EFF. When we're talking about how Veracrypt went through and did this recently. You have to still have trusted individuals verify that this is correct. But it does mean that you can see the code from the beginning open versus it being behind closed doors. So it's a huge misnomer that, oh, it's more secure because it's open. It's not more secure because it's open by default. You have the ability to look at it yourself versus it being in a black box that nobody gets to see. So who is backing that and who is funding that for the last 10 years? And that, in my opinion, is the way the conversation should go. But I'll throw it back to you guys.
So I actually like the analogy of the beer of Gator just gave Silk tainted beer. It went bad, the process failed, and Silk is now on a toilet crapping himself all night long because somebody tainted his beer. But then again, I also that's open source. Open source is the beer that went bad and or Gator poisoned. The other side of the coin is I seem to remember seeing an article or something last week or two about like Coca-Cola or Pepsi where they had to do a recall because something was tainted in their actual process when they were filling the cans or the bottles or something. And they had to do a massive recall and throw things out. That would be what would be considered closed source. So while multiple people are able to find that there's an issue with the open source and actually triage it and come up with solutions for it, closed source means that you have to wait for the manufacturer to find the solution and or wait for them to kill off everyone or all their constituents before they try to solve it.
So I think there's two things, and I'm interested to hear what Gowrie says, but the two things I'll bring up, because I think there are two different parts of the conversation. One is open source code, everyone can review it. But something you said that was so interesting was like, and then you have to wait for them, whomever to go and fix it. What's so interesting is when we talk about like the Log4j team, the Log4j team is reviewing it and looking at the remediation. The Log4j team is doing blah, blah, blah. The Log4j team has looked back through. The Log4j team, unless it's a paid, like most open source, the team which is running it is volunteers. Like it is a group of volunteers. It's not a team who's pushing out remediation. After they get off their day jobs, they jump on Discord or Slack or Matrix or whatever, insert whatever communication. IRC. Perfect. Thank you for that.
That's supposed to be real, man.
IRC. But they jump on that chat platform and they're like, okay, has anyone had a chance to review this issue? Like the world is on fire. And they go, does anyone have a chance to review the issue, or was your work busy? Oh, we were busy patching it and remediating it. We didn't have a chance to actually look at the vulnerability itself. I'm interested to see what you think, Gowrie, though.
So I think there's two things here, right? One is open source being, quote unquote, by default more secure because it is open source. I think this was a misnomer that was taken from the world of actual crypto, right? So actual crypto, that world says your algorithm should be secure even if the full details and all of the code that implements it and everything is published, right? Your cryptographic algorithm should be so secure that even if you know all the details, you still can't break it, before the heat death of the universe. And I think that a lot of people have heard that and they started to think, oh, that's the same with open source. Everything's published. Therefore, if it's all published, therefore it's more secure because that's the same standard that they think of. And I think that's a misnomer. And this leads into the second point, which is open source isn't free. Like we like to call it free and open source software, but it's not free. It's never been free. And this is exactly what you just said. It is the cost of someone's labor that you are not paying for, right? And every time you ingest one of those packages and don't, contribute back or don't give any of the labor back, one, you're basically taking that product for free, which, granted open source licenses, free open source licenses, there's no, that people expect this to be the case. But two, when you have a vulnerability like this, I'm sorry, you don't have a right to complain. Like if you didn't contribute anything to the package whatsoever, and then you're going to come back and be like, oh, why wasn't anyone reviewing this? Why weren't you reviewing it? Right? Like this is the whole point. Oh, free and open source doesn't mean free from labor, free from cost, free from risk. It means free as in you can use it for free, but that doesn't mean you get everything that you need out of it for free. And this is what Gator was saying, is that if you hammer on free and open source to the extent that your products are built on top of it, but you give nothing back, you're a leech. And if you come back and complain that there's stuff broken in it, I mean, hop on, guys. Like, come on, it's open source. You can contribute. So the world being on fire, this is kind of, the world's fault for not, as Gator said, contributing back.
Now, wait a minute. there's you say that I'm not contributing back. I'm upvoting that there's an issue with the package by complaining about it. I'm letting them know that there's issues that need to be resolved and that everyone agrees around those issues. But this is actually, I know that I keep pulling this in weird directions, but I seem to remember another article from years ago about citizens in the community that went around and started to patch their own potholes in their neighborhood because the city wasn't.
Right.
And they were everyone was losing their minds saying, you can't do that, you can't do that. And they're like, we don't care, we're tired of driving through holes. And they were patching them. And then the city and the lawyers were like, you really can't do that, because if somebody gets injured, then you're now at fault. They can sue you because you did a substandard job, and this is why we do X amount of things. And that kind of seems what the open source community is. We found an issue with software, with how closed source was working. And we then chose to build our own versions of it. And now it's, hey, if it catches on fire, who do we blame? Do we blame anyone? Can we blame ourselves? And it's one of those things that we couldn't keep going down the path of closed source because major companies do not care, and they will avoid patching and fixing things until they are forced to. And now that there's open source out there, they're forced to be more open with their policies, procedures, and how they handle things than what they were 20, 30 years ago when there wasn't a big open source community.
I mean,
Go ahead, Silk.
I was going to say, I don't know if I necessarily agree with some of that. Like, I think the reason why some of open source exists is not that it's solving problems. Like, someone has a problem, they go, I need to solve this. Like Log4j, I can't speak with like expertise on how the project came about originally, but the problem it solved is that it was fast logging. Most logging packages which exist in Java at that point, and now it's been cross-compiled to like everything. You can pull Log4j into almost every language now. It doesn't have to be Java, but they're not necessarily vulnerable. But it solved the problem of we need a way of creating, of doing logging without creating like resource overhead. It's a speed-first package. That was their problem. They never had, here's how we're going to make profit around this. Here, like a lot of successful open source has found, here is our profit-making model. Getting my point is, they started this with a problem. They're like, this is how we're going to go about fixing it. And then the open source project grew and it morphed and got more and more complex. Most open source start with a problem, which maybe enterprises have, but at the end of the day, here's the problem. Here's what we're going to build to fix it. Closed source does the exact same thing. Companies do the exact same thing. They don't just share it. The reason, so spinning back to my point where Goulot was saying, oh, they're maintained, they have policies, they have procedures. No, I don't think they are. I think they're starting this open source project because they need help from other people to get it done. They're not doing it because they have funding. They're doing it because here's my problem, here's my fix for it. Like, I need help. Someone help me fix this thing and make it work. Like, it might be an overgeneralization, but
it's an interesting thought process, because to be honest with you, there are going to be some open source projects that are looking for contributors, and there are other people who have a complete package done to where it fixes their problem. And if they can have somebody else reuse their code for another problem that's somewhat similar, but they need to tweak it, they can then grab that, they can fork it, and then they can be able to use it for their needs. So that becomes the question, is that generalizing one way or another? There's a whole bunch of use cases with open source. So it's not just going to be one way.
I mean, I think one of the problems comes in. Oh, go on, Gary.
I was going to say, for any developers who are watching the stream, this is actually a really important point in that, you know, those disclaimers on every single open source package that says this comes with no warranty and you accept all the risks. This is exactly why those statements are important. Because of exactly this issue. Because then it puts, the fault, the quote unquote fault of whose fault is this. I had an interesting discussion with Silk earlier this week. I asked him, is this technically a vulnerability or is this a feature? right? And this is an interesting question because it almost looks like this was almost intended, not in a malicious sense, but like it seems like, oh, hey, this solves a problem and it solves my problem. And maybe
Yes.
I use this, to get around something, but it causes problems for other people, right? So this is one of those examples where I say, well, if a specific thing was pushed that enabled this to occur, is it technically a feature or is it a bug? And this is where you get to those statements of there's no warranty for this, and it resolves you of responsibility if someone else uses your code.
Now,
Right.
I disagree with that, because every EULA I have ever read, whether it be Microsoft or I don't know, Java, Oracle, whatever, they all say we are not held liable for whatever happens to our stuff. If that was the case, then Microsoft would be being sued all the time for all the random ransomware things that exist because of a flaw or bug in their OS. It's everyone is like, here's our stuff. You can't sue us even though you paid for it or you downloaded it for free. It's
So this is actually kind of funny. This is actually kind of funny because Microsoft had this bug. Actually, I was having this discussion with a colleague of mine. So as a C developer, it is crazy to me that between Linux and Windows, a long integer on Windows is 32-bit, and a long integer on Linux is 64-bit, or I think it's tied to whatever the pointer size is. So on 32-bit, it'll be 32, whatever the case. The reason this remains today is because an absurd number of developers developed software for Windows that used the long int type. And when Windows tried to update it to 64-bit, they broke everyone's stuff. And then all of the developers collectively tried to sue Microsoft, and Microsoft was like, fine, we'll just leave it as 32-bit. Fine. And that's why this disparity exists, because of a lawsuit. I'm not kidding. Like, this is true. And it continues to be that case today.
I have a real world example for that as well. So Microsoft bought GitHub, right? In theory, Microsoft Windows should work with Git, but it doesn't. Microsoft Git, the version that it uses is only 32-bit. So you're limited to 4 gig file sizes because of that whole long issue that Gowrie just described. In Linux, it works great because it's all 64-bit and there's no issues. But Microsoft didn't rebuild the open source Git package. All they did, all the developers did was they copied the Linux package over, kind of encapsulated it in, and now all Git on Microsoft is all based off of 32-bit because of that long issue.
I'm going to bring this to, I think, a different point. I'll close this point out if anyone has any arguments before I move us a little bit.
Go for it, man. I think we're good to go to the next part.
I think, all right, so where I'm going with this is there's two pieces. One is licensing. Like, there's this whole concept of licensing, which made this whole thing remarkably weirdly prevalent. There's, in high level, again, not a lawyer or anything like that, you have the MIT license. You can grab it. You can do whatever you want with it. You can make profit off of it. It doesn't need to remain open source. You need to include the license, blah, blah, blah. Apache, very similar. You can grab it. You can incorporate it into your commercial product. Log4j, include it in your commercial project. Compile it. Create the jar file. Include it anywhere you want. We don't need to open source it. And then you have like GNU GPL, where it's like the moment you pull that package in, everything you do needs to be open source, like your entire thing. Now, there's ways around this. Question is that, do you feel, Gator, is that detrimental to the open source community when you have these licenses which allow you to pull these things into commercial products, build them, and they don't have to give back? Like, is that the fix, do you think, for open source to get the companies involved? I guess I'll pose the question this way. You have brought up the problem of funding for these projects, which are massively used. Again, and Gowrie brought up the point of it's the company's fault. You use this, you didn't review it, it's on you. You effectively went out to Stack Overflow, grabbed the fix, grabbed the top answer, incorporated it in your code without thinking about it. That one's on you. So The first question is, how do you fix it? How do you get companies involved? Is it licensing? Is it a tax? Like, what is it?
So this is an age-old question, Silk, to where everybody's going to have a different answer. First off, when it comes to licensing, I dropped a couple links into the chat with talking about the different open source licensing and comparisons of those from Wikipedia. We're all not lawyers and couldn't suggest which one to necessarily use for you. You
can
however,
hold Gator fully responsible for anything said on this stream.
You could also go through and talk to the EFF on it. But for what it's worth, whenever I'm going through and doing something, I'm usually doing it Creative Commons to where it's opening up to folks. You have the GPL license, you have APL, you have a whole bunch of different ones out there. To answer your question, Silk, on what's going to solve the problem of this happening or from continuing to happen, if you're using a product of somebody's or even just a package of somebody's, sure, if you change it for your case, depending on your licensing, you may or may not have to commit that back upstream or at least online with attribution. You should be supporting them in some way, shape, or form. And for us, when we're going through and talking about building like a Raspberry Pi product, and we're doing this at home versus if we're trying to productize this to sell it, that may be a difference to where if you're able to use it for free at home versus if you're going to use it in a production environment, right? Versus if you have a multi-billion-dollar company who's using this in all of their products, there's a strong possibility that they should, or I would say that they should be able to go through and throw money back at the open source contributors because they're literally building it on somebody else. And if they're giving nothing back, I'm just going to come out and say, like we've seen in this last year and a half, 2 years, when it comes to things like the Elk Stack, and then major companies saying, I made this. This is mine. I'm going to support it in my own way now moving forward versus going through and throwing money back to the original developers or whoever's currently working on the project.
But isn't that exactly what you said earlier, though? Like, isn't that like, I can fork it, I can work on it. At what point do I go, okay, it's under the MIT license, I can make money off of this. Okay, fork, add this little piece to it. Oh, I can sell it now. And because they're a bigger company, they can make money. Like, isn't this capitalism at work?
So this is exactly where it comes down to, how do you want to license things? If you don't mind it being out there for everyone, that's completely fine. And this isn't a legally binding agreement. This is about going back and giving back to your community. If you're going to be to the point where you don't want to give anything back and you build on somebody else's, it was up to the person who ended up contributing it and saying what license it is. If they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart versus if they're looking to try to make money off of it, again, it comes down to licensing. So how does it get fixed? The folks who are doing open source, if they want to be able to make money off of it, choose the correct option. Otherwise, you're getting free software and free labor from somebody else. Don't come crying to me when there's a vulnerability in something because, I wanted to make sure that I could do logging to my LDAP server when something came in and authenticate somebody due to something else. So that was my use case, not your use case. But go ahead.
I'm curious about something so I don't want to really delve too far into the licensing talk because none of us are lawyers and knowing our luck we'll all get sued for this. But
again, Gator is fully responsible for anything said on the stream.
No.
I was thinking about what would be the most ported software to the most different types of systems that exist. And strangely, I only came up with one piece of software that I was thinking of, and I'm reading about the license of it now. Okay. And the software is Doom.
Okay.
I've seen Doom run on printers, on DSLR cameras. I've seen it run on vending machines.
Yep.
That's like the true thing of, hey, there's this new device that has a screen. Cool. Can it play Doom?
Yep.
And then everyone starts to port Doom into whatever that is. And it's completely pointless. It doesn't, you learn more about the system and how it works and how it functions. Actually, now that I think about it, when we go to start hacking the bidet, I wonder if we can get Doom to run on the bidet.
Ooh, we got to make it happen. We've got to make it happen.
But yeah, their license is more restrictive than the GNU GPL, but it's also out there and people have been using that source code and setting it up for forever now. And they've been porting it to whatever it is. Granted, it's not critical and it doesn't really matter, but this is something that already exists in the wild. As far as licensing goes, closed source licensing versus open source licensing, I still prefer open source licensing, even if I'm writing the code myself, even if I'm the one that's trying to patch everything. Pretty much everything I write is open source until a company tells me it's not, and it's their job to tell me whether or not I'm in license compliant, because I'm not a lawyer. I'll list out every piece of software I use, every single package I use. I know
Oh,
Gator's been on this whole SBOM thing, which is software bill of materials, forever. And when this Log4j hits, I know every piece of software that at the company that I work at, I know every single piece of software that we use. I know exactly what version it is. I know what every single dependency is. And I'm able to go through and find exactly what uses Log4j, minus some of our cloud stuff like AWS or Google. Some of those are kind of hidden in weird places. But if it installs on a system, I'm in control of that and I know exactly what it is.
I mean, there's a whole slews of software because, like, again, I think there's value to that. Was SBOM, the software bill of materials? Like, I think there is value in that. It's remarkably hard to maintain. I mean, this is why, like, for instance, the licensing becomes remarkably difficult. Like, there's whole softwares built around it. Like, Black Duck is one of them, which just rips through your source code looking for open source packaging and seeing like if you have to what you have to do with those packages. Either split off components. That's often what companies will do. If you rely on an open source package, they go, okay, we're selling this product. We're either going to recreate it in a new way, or we're going to somehow just section this off and open source that piece, which is going to be mostly useless to anyone when they see it. I think the other piece, and this is going to be the next topic, I'm going to throw it to Gowrie because he has not spoken, and I want to hear his voice. But the piece I want to talk about next is there is a massive disconnect. I'm not going to lie. I think Log4j is not a developer problem. I think it was 100% a security problem. Like, I don't mean that. Like, if we split it up at development community, security community, 100% this was a the security community problem and not a development. And the reason I say that was because in 2018, there was a Black Hat talk, which was on JNPL, which was like, again, wasn't on Log4j. It wasn't on disclosing it. It was specifically talking about with JNPL, or JNLP. It was specifically on the vulnerabilities that exist for like template injection there. The security community said, this is a massive issue. The developer said, we're putting this in. There was this weird disconnect between the two groups where we just didn't communicate. Like, they're separate tracks. So I got a soft topic going back to licensing, or if you want to talk about kind of this weird disconnect, going to you, Gowrie.
So on the licensing side, licensing is really difficult. And you keep repeating this, and I've been wanting to correct you on this, where you say like, oh, we find a GPL thing and then we section it off so we don't have to. All right, the GPL is very special. If you touch GPL software in any way, and I'm not talking about LGPL, which is limited GPL. If you touch GPL software in any way other than through like the way it's meant to be interacted with after it's compiled, if you touch that source code, you are GPL, period. The end. There's no sectioning it off and putting it off into its other component unless you're going to compile that and turn it into its own interface and like you're using it after it's compiled. That's one way of doing it. I think that's why folks like VMware have their drivers and stuff posted online. Yep. So that's one. LGPL is special. Am I breaking up on you guys?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit, but
okay.
We're catching it all.
All right. LGPL gives you the dynamically link with things, and that works better. And then you have the whole host of MIT and BSD and all of these that let you ingest software and use them however you want. It even keep them closed source after you do it. And then there's a few that force contribution back if you make any changes. And it's a nightmare to maintain any of these things as a software developer, even to the extent that, and Silk and I were talking about this earlier this week, there will be software packages that are like under MIT, and then the open source team will switch them to GPL overnight. And what happens is with companies, no one ever thinks about this. When a package changes licenses to a more restrictive license like GPL, whoever was highly embedded with that previously has no choice but to either fork off their own version and maintain it, stop updating it altogether, or completely replace it, right? And this, for most companies, what they do is they just stop updating it altogether. So the question is going to be, like, let's say one of these packages, like Log4j, switches from a permissive license to a less permissive license. How many of these types of vulnerabilities are out there and are literally never going to get fixed in anyone's software because no one has the money to go through every piece of source code out there and find and patch all of these things that are no longer getting automatically updated. The licensing problem is kind of a nightmare. And to answer Silk's original question was like, is the restrictive licensing a solution to the funding or a problem in that people won't adopt it? And it is like, that's the, as Gator said, like the quintessential question of open source. And I don't think anyone really has a good answer for that. And I don't want to get into that debate because it's a rabbit hole.
It is a deep, dark rabbit
So-
hole.
I've got something. So Silk was talking about the difference between the developer community and the security community. Out of the people on this stream, I think that I'm positioned really well to argue this because I do a lot of stupid random things, especially for work. I'm a systems engineer. I design networks, I design clouds, I design a whole bunch of random crap. But I also do pen testing on the side. I occasionally dabble in programming, even though I hate programming. The problem is I'm above average in each one of those fields. I can design your network, I can design your cloud, I can write the software that runs on those, and I can security test those. I suck at writing reports. But the interesting thing about that is most developers aren't that way. Gowrie is a hell of a developer. He's an awesome programmer, and he knows a little bit about security, but I don't know if he's capable enough to go through all of his code to run through fuzzing and actually harden his code without having somebody else that's more adept at that. And when you look at the open source community, like the Log4j, there's 3 people that are maintaining that? Are they only developers? And if they're only developers, do we expect them to actually write secure code, or do we expect the community, such as the security community, to go back through, test that, give them feedback so that they can update their code? We can't expect everyone in open source that writes a piece of software to be able to write it securely and run through every test that they need to run through because they may not know how to do that. But that's also the benefit of open source, is anyone in the security community, the development community, can go in, take a look at that, and actually help out that project if they so choose.
I mean, I agree to a certain extent. Like, I guess there's nothing necessarily I disagree with any of that statement saying that security community is there. I don't. Developers can write secure code. Like, that's the thing. It's like, this is another thing me and Gowrie were talking about is when the component was originally exist, and I have like a weird opinion when it comes to open source projects. For the most part, I think they should be very component-sized, like smaller pieces. Now, this is a big general statement. For the most part, things like Log4j started to solve a very small problem, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. And with the increase of complexity, increases the number of vulnerabilities. Like, this is just, the more complex systems are, the more vulnerabilities that are going to exist. The kicker with this one, though, is as it became more and more complex, this is where, like, Bitwarden had a third-party audit do an audit on them. I don't know. Most of these projects are not going to be able to do that. Here's where it becomes kind of weird to me, and this is where it becomes really complicated. There's a lot of closed source software in commercial products that incorporated Log4j. They are required to be compliant. SOC 2. SOC 2 within their code, do security assessments, do source code analysis. But here's where it becomes weird. And this is where I think it's just the lacking of some of the compliances, is in order to be compliant with these, you have to do source code analysis on your code. Like, you can do a pen test on the entire application, do a web application pen test or whatever it is on your application. But third-party code exists in this really weird spot where it doesn't really fall under auditable. It doesn't necessarily have to get touched. There's also weird legal issues when you go and audit someone else's code, because not some third-party components are going to be closed source. So you can audit your code, but not their code. And the risk these third-party packages have is growing by the minute. Heck, even if just you compile your third-party code, you put it there, and you never touch it. What happens is in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, in 10 years later, a vulnerability is found with these things. And like Gowrie said, they never update. So I guess I'm going to bring this to my point, which is the third-party packages, which increase massive vulnerabilities. Like it's in the OWASP top 10 outdated third-party components. Like it exists in this place where it may never get audited. Like legally, by a compliance, by almost any standard right now, they exist in this amorphic place where they might not get tested. And this is where I don't have a good solution. My point is like they can sit there and they don't have the security they need. They're not maintained. But going back to the security community and the development community, I think developers can write secure code, but there's no way they can keep up when their systems get so complex. Like when they increase all these extra functionalities, the more complex the system is, they're not going to be able to maintain. Like, again, this was called out in 2016 at Black Hat saying, here's the risk. And no one made the connection for another 5 years. Like, that is a massive disconnect. And again, really weird rant, but there's kind of there you go. You have that to talk about.
So this is kind of interesting because I hate to do this. I'm going to quote Elon Musk, which, but I'm pretty sure he's quoting something else. One of the things he does in engineering that he says, like step 1 or step 2 or whatever it is, he says we aggressively delete stuff. We remove things that are complex. We remove complexities from the system so that we simplify stuff. And it's for exactly this reason. The less complex your system is, the fewer things can fail, period. And this is what if you guys had been privy to these conversations, we had so many things. This is why the topic is what it is this week. It's not just that when you pull in third-party packages, you're opening yourself up to vulnerabilities. It's that these vulnerabilities start to present themselves as a result of your expectations of what a piece of code does, not meeting what the actual piece of code does, right? So when you expect it to do one thing and it's actually doing that thing plus 20 other things, and you don't know about those 20 other things, it is not possible for you to really reasonably and securely integrate that code into your code stack. So, and the example I'll give you is just like, let's imagine that there was no vulnerability all by itself with Log4j. Let's say you pull it in, but when you match it up and you use it in concert with another package, all of a sudden you are, shipping data from one unverified source into here. Or let's say you go from a third-party package that has input validation, then you're not subject to this. But if you have something that is taking, data from an unvalidated source and you're not doing input validation, then you are subject to this. But you are not. But everyone thinks that Log4j is doing input validation. Then there's this massive disconnect between what you are expecting a piece of code to do and what it is actually doing. And so it's when you say developers can write secure code, I actually vehemently disagree with that. I disagree with that unless what they are writing is so small that they themselves, one single person, can understand the entire system, then I believe that's possible. But once you start adding packages together and once you start integrating code packages with each other, it's not possible for one person to understand all of the interactions that are going to be had. So in those cases, I don't think it's really possible to write secure, actually provable code. The only ones that I can think about that have done this is there's an operating system out there, I think it's called Green Hills, that has formal verification of their entire code base, which is a mathematical proof to show that it's not subject to some level of vulnerabilities. So unless you're doing formal verification, which is, mind you, absurdly expensive to do and extremely difficult and very sciencey, science heavy, unless you're doing that level, I'm going to disagree. I don't think it's possible to write secure code in any sense. You can use stuff like Rust or like memory safe languages to get rid of certain types of vulnerabilities, but code like Rust would not have prevented a Log4j, which is primarily a logic issue, not a not a memory issue. So yeah, I guess I will just disagree with you and state that I don't think it's possible to write secure code, and I don't pretend that it is. This is why I had my rant last week. I was just like, this is what software's always been this bad.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
I'll counter I'll defend myself, and I'll hand it over to Gulo, which is, I agree. I am not saying developers can write secure code. I'm saying, actually, I'll say it this way. Developers absolutely can write secure code. The problem is, in a very simple sense, this is what their code was designed to do. But the moment they take that component and add it to another component, which adds to another component, and it becomes complex, their expectations for their code might be accurate. And I think that is going to be my definition of security is, here is their expectations for the code. Here is how the code performs. I think the moment, though, that becomes any level of complex beyond that, they cannot judge their expectations are going to get out of whack the moment another developer comes in and starts adding additional functionality on top. So
not just adding additional functionality, right? This is the kicker. Let's say you pull in a header file to some interface. And Log4j is a good example. And you read the header file and you read, this function does X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. My interpretation of what your comments stated this function does is what produces my expectation for what your code actually does, right? So you could write a perfectly secure interface in the context of whatever your use case is, because you know how to use it correctly, and as soon as someone else uses it, they may use it in a way it wasn't intended, right? And no additions required.
And something you said right there was documentation. Like, I had a conversation with someone on Discord right before this, which said the Holy Trinity when it comes to testing, when it comes to security, when it comes to development, really when it comes to almost anything in technology, but I did it in the context of penetration testing, is skills here, communication here, and documentation here. If you have all three, you have the Holy Trinity, like you will go far in this industry. If you have two of those things, you will still go remarkably far, and you will be successful with any one of those things. But when it comes down to like open source, the thing which throws this whole thing for a loop is you get multiple people coming in and out of the project working on their component and launching out. Security coming in, auditing, telling them to fix something, but they don't know even that thing they're fixing, the ramifications on all the other components that put this in. Like, documentation is so key, but even if you have perfect documentation and I list out the expectations, those can be misinterpreted by the next person. Gulo.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see what you got.
I completely agree with Gowrie, and that was my argument is a single developer may or may not know how to write secure code. They can write really secure code or they could write really crap code. It's up to the community to help them out because somebody cannot be an expert in absolutely everything, and they also can't see into the future. You mentioned Stack Overflow earlier. When I'm writing a piece of code, I try not to pull in third-party packages. I try to look at the third-party package for the function that I need. Now, yes, I do use third-party packages, but I try to pull out the sections that I need of those packages for the code that I'm writing that only does specifically what I need it to do, because I don't need all of the excess bloat that's associated with it. Next guy down the line may need more bloat. Somebody else may need less. And I don't necessarily do that with the security side of things. I do that because I grew up with, and I'm old as sin, so we didn't have all this memory that we could dump our projects into. So I try to write small, efficient code as best as I can, but I'm really crappy at it. I do use third-party packages, though, as in open source. I'm running Linux. It's whatever jobs that I work at. Usually I'm using Like I've built the elk stack before. I do all of those things, and I have to trust the developers to a certain extent. And I have to do that for both open source and closed source, because I also run Windows at most companies that I work at. I'll build up a domain controller. I'll run Active Directory. And it comes down to, is the closed source any more secure than the open source? What is the patching that's available for closed source versus open source? And how many people can actually look and solve those problems? The community came together for Log4j, and they're like, oh shit, everything's on fire. And there were multiple people that could have stepped up and actually helped. If a vulnerability at Microsoft happens, the amount of developers that could actually pop in, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to bash Microsoft all that much, but how many people could actually help out and be like, hey, here's a patch for this. Here's how that you can solve this problem. Because they're closed source, they can only rely on the developers that they have. And yes, they have an entire army, but they don't have a world behind them.
Yep. Could not agree more. And to your point there is that if we're going to go through and use open source in our products or whatever else, if we're doing this at home versus we're doing it in a product, and in my opinion, go throw money at the people if you are a business building things on open source. When it comes to who could go through and fix that, there are only certain skilled individuals in the world who can go through and do so. It would, if we were to look at how much open source has been contributed by people that you wouldn't necessarily think. It could be folks from random farmers out in the middle of nowhere to people who are welding to people. It comes from all sorts and all sorts of background. And if you want to be able to make sure this actually continues moving forward, you've got to not only either volunteer time or volunteer money. Again, free as in beer, not as in freedom of speech, because it's got to be somebody who's helping maintain that. And I'm a big proponent of like what you guys were saying about the SBOM, or some people call it the software inventory, or knowing what your ports, protocols, and services that you're running. How well do you know your network and your network stack? And instead of just saying that we're going to go push this live to folks, and this is the direction that we're heading now, versus, hey, do you have a software inventory? Do you know what patches and updates that you have? And again, if you're talking small, like us building our own labs at home versus people who are doing this in enterprise and in industry, that becomes a whole different deal. And we could go down the whole compliance side of the house if we really wanted to, by saying that most of the time you have to have those software bills of materials, but I'll pass that back to you guys. Where do you want to go with this?
There's something both of you said, though, which is both Gulo and you both said, oh, well, I don't need the entire package. I'll pull this little piece of the package out, which means it's a piece of code which is no longer maintained, or it adds you to now maintain this piece of code within your code. So like anytime you pull a piece of code, it now adds to your maintenance. Where if you have these third-party packages, the other thing I'll counter with Gator is you said, oh, easy, software bill of materials. Like, at what point do you bring what nuance do you bring that down to? Because let's say you bring in, oh, I need sockets. I'm not going to write an entire library or class for just to open a socket. I'm going to use someone else's. So do I include that? Well, it's part of the language, and that has vulnerabilities in and of itself. So, oh, well, I don't want to use the third-party package. I will compile this random Apache Log4j into its own jar file and include it in my package. Like it is incredibly hard to maintain those things. I think Gowry's next then.
For the software, I agree that if I'm writing software, I have to maintain that software. If I'm pulling in third-party packages or third-party pieces of code, I need to make sure that I'm actually maintaining that. That is my job to do, because it's now my software. On the flip side or on the other hand of that, the other reason that I pull in exactly what I need rather than full packages, some of the time, 50-50, I'd say, is I have to understand how it works for me to support it. I cannot bring in random crap that I cannot support, because if it breaks, I'm the one that's on the hook. I have to figure it out, whether it's my code or whether I'm building an Elk stack or Prometheus or whatever it is, I'm the one that has to figure out how to fix it and how to get production back up and running. Now, I also want to bash on open source and Gator a little bit because CentOS. I had just upgraded my company to CentOS 8, and it had 8 years of support left, and they removed it and said, okay, end of life in 2021. 1 year after I deployed that, they removed 7 years of support for a piece of software and went to what's called a streaming OS, which is also what Ubuntu does. When we're talking about these things, yes, I can get patches more quickly, but I also can't manage my software as effectively because now I'm on what's considered a streaming OS. I'm receiving packages and updates that I can't track because of how the industry is now developing and designing the software. Is it more secure? Possibly, because I'm getting more updates, but I have less knowledge of my environment because I don't have control over what's being installed.
This is a very interesting point. I'll cross my fingers and I'll hand it back to Silk.
I got one more, and then it's going to Gowrie, which is something that Gulo said just made me laugh because on one side of things, the best thing you can do is like when you upgrade, they remove code and they deprecate pieces of it. Or you can do what Java does, which is never deprecate anything ever. So your Java application that worked like at the beginning of Java still works in the latest version. So, okay, at one point we can just maintain your software forever and then it's Java, or we can deprecate pieces and force you to upgrade. Gowrie.
So I'm just sitting here laughing because we're talking about a billion different ways that people maintain software and the ways different packages or different operating systems do updates and all that stuff. And I'm just laughing because this is an excellent example of anytime you hear the word industry standard, you should just throw the bullshit flag, right? Because in this industry in particular, there's no such thing. There is no such thing as industry standard for anything. Right? That's why there's that XKCD comic where it's like, well, there's 15 standards to describe how to do XYZ. I'm going to make a standard that describes how to do this once and for all and combines everyone's thing. And then the next panel is, there are now 16 standards that describe how to do this thing. There's no such thing as industry standard. Everyone has different management models. And like, here's one of the things that people don't really appreciate, right? Whether or not you actually have a computer science degree or you're just a coder who picked up Python or C or whatever in your spare time, it doesn't really matter. You are engaging in a science that is less than a century old, right? Computer science, which is highly mathematical when you get into like the super sciencey aspect, but when you actually start to reason about certain concepts of whether or not you can do certain things, the realities of stuff like the halting problem and what problems you can actually reason about and what things you can actually analyze, which I would totally love to do a stream on by itself. But you're engaging in a science that is so young that we don't really comprehend everything about it yet. We're still figuring it out, right? Like calculus is what, a millennia old at this point? Like, we know the calculus has been around for longer than we thought. Like, I think most people think it's a couple hundred years old. I'm pretty sure it's like a millennia old, maybe longer at this point. It's a well understood, concept. Maybe they got things wrong along the way and we've corrected it over the centuries, but we have a very good, as a human species, grasp on this. Computer science and software development and thinking about software development and all of these things, dude, it's the Wild West right now. We understand to some extent how we should do stuff, quote unquote, test-driven development. But like, that's not the science of it. The science of it would be, how do we make a system in which these things can never happen? And is it possible? And in many cases, the answer is no, it's not possible to do that because of certain analytical properties of software, like the deep mathematical truths of software. You can't do it. There are certain theorems that you simply can't prove. But I forget where I was going on this rant, but this is kind of what I was saying in the rant from last week's stream. I was just like, the more you learn about software, how it gets made, how it gets maintained, how it gets shipped out, how it gets ingested, all of these things, it becomes more and more of a marvel that anything actually works, let alone anything works, let alone is secure in any sense.
Well, and that's the
So-
funny part is it doesn't matter. Like, if you look at it, software is just built on top of each other. Like, for the most part, there is nothing new under not nothing new under the sun, but like there is no such thing as unique original software unless you're building, oh gosh, even if you're building it in assembly, like at certain point you are just building on top of someone else's libraries and code or coding languages. I mean, this is why like Spectre and Meltdown were just mind-numbing, because it hit the very foundation of a lot of programs. Like, it doesn't matter what you do, you're still building on top of someone. And someone who's like, oh yeah, just go in Python because you're not pulling in all these things. Like, that's why Python is massive, because it has all these things built in. Yeah, you're not pulling them in, but you're using just Python. That there it is.
So when it comes to trust, though, I'm going to go to this point that you said, and then I'll go back to Gulos, which is when it comes to trusting anything at this point, your example of Meltdown and Spectre, that's at a super, super, super low level when it comes to hardware, to where that was integrated in from the start. They were actually using a different operating system, didn't tell anybody about it, to run the low level, and then it started building on top of that. And when it came to, if you had the actual punch out from, or the ability to find out how that was vulnerable, and you had to go through and end up having root to be able to go through and do anything on there anyway, right? So yes, if you got onto the box, you're able to privilege escalate, then you're able to start escaping the sandbox and be able to go to other processes on there. So that's why it was a big deal with cloud. But rolling to this one, when it going back to CentOS and this split between there, the messaging on the whole CentOS sucked, because just like Gulo went through and upgraded his company from CentOS 7 to CentOS 8. During that same time, it was Christmas break of last year, man. I had gone through and completely rebuilt my lab here at home, which we're trying to build the whole network lab. So it's not as huge as what Gulo's dealing with, but I'm like, I just switched from 7 to 8. Okay, this is great. I'm up to date. We're good. And what the shit is this? So I was just as disheartened when I'm like, okay, I'm using an open source product from the community, and I want to make sure that everybody else can build the exact same software stack with me by using these packages. And then I find out, well, that's going to be changing. And my thought process when it came to Red Hat announcing that, Red Hat's announcement sucked. Straight up, and this is my own opinion, the announcement absolutely sucked. They didn't have all the information up front and how they were going to help go through and mitigate that. What they ended up doing 2 months later was opening up so you could get a RHEL developer license and use it up to 16 instances for free, virtual or physical. Okay, great. That should have been messaged way back in the day for small groups, but if you're talking about larger groups, you do have to now move to this idea of streaming or constantly updating OS. On one hand, that falls in line with the whole, and I'm going to say a buzz phrase and everybody will have to drink, the DevSecOps or DevOps or DevSecOps or whatever you want to go through and put the sec wherever you want to.
I'll put the sec wherever I want to.
Oh, thanks, Silk. There's our clip for today, folks. Mark it. Making sure that we're able to go through, and how often are we updating these packages? Are they sitting stagnant, or are we starting to build things to where we have an environment that we're able to go test our software and roll it out? So the whole CI/CD, making sure that we have that built in, DevSecOps versus DevOpsSec, and it's the everybody bashing heads. But to the point of, yeah, no, that sucked. I'm glad that there are other open source projects that are out there. So there's like Rocky, there's Alma. And to be honest with you, since that time frame, I was disappointed with CentOS and said, you know what, let's go try this thing. And I went to CentOS Streams, and I've been running a few different processes on it all year long, and I've had zero issues with it. Now, that's for me and my use case. That's not for everybody's use case, because I'm constantly updating and have those auto update. In your other enterprise situations, when I was supporting other enterprises in the past, I absolutely snapshotted my OS releases to where it had to be exactly the same. All the packages were downloaded in an offline situation to where whenever I had to spin up a new box, I absolutely knew that it was going to be exactly the same as the other deployed boxes.
All right, I'm going to pull this back to open source, though. Like, and the messaging was terrible, but I'm going to pull it back to communication then. Like, for communication, open source package, how do you fix that? Like, how is that a thing?
So I've got one other point that I want to bring up. So you were talking about hardware level exploits, right? What I seem to remember in the last week or two that there was something with iPhones or iMessage or something to where it wasn't necessarily exploitable, as in you couldn't do a specific thing on there, but you could get access to memory where you could build your own OS on that device so that you could hack into the memory on something else and then start reading messages or something. I want to say, was it JBig2 or some crap like that? JBLG. It was something along those lines.
I got it.
I'll have to check.
No, I was just saying I haven't heard it, so I can't speak to it.
Yeah, I have not either, which is surprising. And if Gator hasn't heard of it, it's probably made up.
No, I trust Gulo. It was probably so. I know that there was some issues with the Log4j when it came to iCloud, to where if you renamed your iPhone, you could go through and screw some stuff up. But I'm super interested to hear more about this, Gulo, because while we're trying to do the weekly news with the Holland Network podcast, I haven't come across that, and it's been It's been since the beginning of the week. So
it's the zero click. I'm going. It's the zero click iMessage exploit remote.
I did hear about this. This
the Pegasus one, isn't it?
This was the one, by Pegasus, where it was. I mean, so let's bring up a point. I am a big fan of Apple. I'll say it right there. I'm a big fan of Google and open source too. Like I love all technology, but I like Apple because they own the hardware, they own the software, they own the App Store. They have control of everything. It's not open, but everything kind of works on it. But what's so interesting about this is if you look at it, this is the perfect scenario for the most secure device ever. They own hardware, they own software, they own the operating system level, they own every piece of software needs to go through them. This is the ideal solution to have the most secure thing in the world. Yet, any company, or a company will say, that targeted it, they made an entire business around coming up with zero-day exploits. Not even zero-day, I don't know, end day, like non-released exploits, which got full code execution for the system, or able to steal data or location data. Like, given enough time, money, or resources, any system can be breached, even if it is the ideal one. The other thing I was going to mention specific to Log4j, and it was, I'm losing it right now. I will think of it in a moment, and I will pull it on back. Gowrie.
So I will say.
Go on, Gator.
Go ahead. So I was going to say, the reason why I got into security and the reason why I love open source so much is because you have the ability to go help contribute and give back. I see a huge gap in this to where any of the softwares that I'm going through and touching now, or working with my customers or with my company, I have the ability to make a positive effect there. So I want to make sure that the whole DevSec and Ops side of the house actually talk with each other and start working with each other. And that takes time, that takes a culture change, and that takes a shift in how we've always done things, moving into something that's potentially more secure. But it's with time and effort, and it's not free. I'll pass it to anybody else who wants to.
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to say, which was for Log4j. Right before this morning, I actually pushed out a video saying, like, is this the worst vulnerability that ever happened? Like, legitimately, by prevalency, is this the worst? And I even said, just like hazelnut coffee, I don't care what you say, Aunt Kathy. It's not coffee. I'm not drinking it this Christmas. Stop making it. No one likes it. Hits very deep for me. But with it is like, I actually legitimately think this might be the worst thing. I'm getting a call. Stop calling me right now. There we go. It's popping up on the screen. She probably heard it. She's probably watching. Gosh, she's like, I'm calling him right now. Hazelnut coffee is actually the best. I know I actually legitimately think it may be the worst vulnerability because it was because it was open source, because anyone could pull it in. It was massively prevalent. In the thing that which made me think of this was Gator's iCloud exploit, where you just change the name of your iPhone. Now, actually, there was something really interesting that happened, which I didn't realize. A lot of the exploits that were getting released, like in the wild, because the way you were showing exploits was dropping like a canary token or something like that and having it called. But what was so weird was Google, as part of the anti-spam, because they didn't want things to be searched, what they would do is they would ping the request to see if it was a valid URL. Live Overflow actually just talked about this, which was super interesting. So a lot of the exploits that were said prevalent online might not have actually been exist, because people would spin up a burp collaborator, shoot the DNS request off at the attack, and then Google would ping the DNS request to say, is this valid? And then, so there might be a lot of false positives going out right now, but it was just like, it was so prevalent because it was open source. I think that's what made this one so much worse, is if it was a closed source package, I don't think it would have been as bad.
Okay, this goes, I'm going to slightly turn the direction then and say, if you do responsible disclosure, it's not as bad versus if you just dropped 0 days out there. But the fact is, that's going to happen. So if 0 days are dropped, it doesn't matter. We're going to have this issue with Java. We're going to have this issue with other open source and closed source software. None of it is better than the other. Go ahead.
I disagree. I think even if they had done responsible disclosure as opposed to this being thrown out in the wild, I think this would have been just as bad. In particular, because this is a logging service and because it's been used, and in particular, because it's been around since 2013, because it's been around for 8 years and freely possible, there's just so many pieces of software that have been written since then that if they brought this in, like I said, they may have stopped updating the packages, or a change might have been made in a package that prevented them from updating it without having to go in and rewrite an entire component or something like that. And the company just doesn't have the money to support stuff. Whatever reason is, because it's been around for so long, even if it had been disclosed, quote unquote, appropriately, I think it would be just as bad, because you're going to find all of the software out there that is integrating it that hasn't been updated and won't get updated. That's really the thing that we're going to have to see how this pans out in the long run, is how much software out there can't get the fix for this, or will never get the fix for this, or just like well, no, but like who's depending on a third-party package that depends on Log4j, and that third-party package is end of life and dead, right? Like, where are these derivative things that you don't even know you're susceptible, and the package is dead anyway?
In one other one, and I'll hand it to Gulo, is when that third-party package is deprecated and it's no longer supported. So someone forks that and just fixes it, but doesn't they fix it because something else broke, and it pulls in Log4j, and then it shows it's maintained, but it's not actually maintained. Like, again, Aunt Kathy, this is your fault. Your stupid hazelnut coffee. Go ahead, Gulo, it's all you.
I agree with Gowrie, but I also think he missed a major point of this, of responsible disclosure. And maybe this is a topic for another time, but responsible disclosure, if this was responsibly disclosed and the developers went through and fixed it, they're going to submit a patch, and then people will start to download the patch and update it. A lot of hacking that I've seen in the recent years has been reading through the update notes, I just lost what it's called,
CVE.
for like Microsoft, and realizing like, hey, this update has this specific exploit into it, and now people know that exists, so they start writing exploit code and then deploying it out for all the people that aren't updating it. Responsible disclosure, yes, we could patch it without letting the entire world know, but then everyone's going to know anyways, and they're going to write the code to exploit it. So it's kind of a toss-up of, if it's open source, responsible disclosure probably doesn't exist that much. If it's closed source and responsible disclosure could exist, because they could patch it on like the down low and send it out, but it'll still be known to the community once those patch notes are released, and then they're going to start writing exploit code.
Again,
Okay.
I'm gonna say, and then I'll hand it off to Gator. Is it? I know, Gator, you're dying right now.
You're good. I'm
But
good. Go for it.
It doesn't, even if this was a completely responsible disclosure, 100%, 3 months ahead of time, patched, and somehow no one looked at the patch notes or anything like that. Let's just say somehow this mythical land exists that this happens. The adoption rate for this package is remarkably low right now. Like even if you look at the package maintained, 28.6 million downloads in 4 months. They're not going to just pull that down and just patch it unless something breaks. It was going to take a vulnerability for them to go, I need to go look through my code and incorporate this fix. It's not just going to like magically happen. And you can't, it's like a Windows update or like a Linux update where you can just like go to your repo manager and say, okay, what's out of date? Like dependency of a dependency of a dependency of a dependency. And you're waiting for all these patches. Right now, there is still major products and appliances that are not fixed. They cannot update this package without breaking things.
Just take the Mars rover, for example. I know it's like super sensational to be like the Mars rover or the helicopter or whatever is susceptible to this to Log4j. And like that one's not getting popped. It's whatever.
Yeah.
Who cares about that? But also
That's
it's
truly
the
remote
perfect,
execution.
but yeah. But it's the perfect example of we don't know where this is. It's literally anywhere. You would never expect it to be on the Mars rover. Not in a million years would I have expected Java to be on the Mars rover.
And here's the thing is,
I would have
with
expected
any ejection point, and I'm going to have it right back, like with any injection point, that's what's terrifying. Not only is this massively prevalent, but we live in an age where we log everything. And anywhere there's a log, you can inject it there. Gowrie, sorry, go right back to you.
that's why like maybe it's a little sensationalist to say it's the worst vulnerability ever, but it's pretty bad. And because the thing I would say is that every single vulnerability that gets released probably on a weekly basis that patches some vulnerability in the Linux kernel or a Linux driver is exactly this vulnerability. It's the same thing, right? This is why I said in the first rant last week, like everyone wants to talk about remote code execution and this and that and whatever. It's like, you guys realize this is a weekly thing. Like this, it's only huge because of how easy, like your grandma can exploit this by opening her iPhone and changing the name of it, right? This one is just that egregious in that a layman could find the string and type it into their iPhone. But like, on a weekly basis, everything's broken, and whoever does an update is susceptible to this vulnerability type patches. And so this is why when people are like, oh, this could have been prevented, this could have been this, it was just like, you know what, if it wasn't this, it would be something else,
Yeah, I would argue, though, I do think it was the most prevalent, though. Like, that's the difference. It is the most prevalent, probably at least in recent age. Because even more than Heartbleed, which was OpenSSL, where it's like everything that runs SSL is vulnerable. Like, more things run this, Log4j, than OpenSSL. And I think OpenSSL even ran it.
Yeah, there's
Just kidding.
Billions of devices out there, but pass this over to Gator because I think he's going to explode.
That was kind of my point.
So, to your point exactly, every single week when it comes to the Holy Network podcast, we're talking about and grabbing the latest exploits to where literally when we're talking about CISA, constantly, weekly posting things online saying, hey, here's vulnerable. When have you gone through and patched this? To where you've got these bulletins that are usually a week old. And the reason why Digital and I usually go through and talk about these things is like, hey, if you've got a week patch cycle, as in like 1 week, 7 days, you're sitting pretty good. Most people do it a lot longer than that. So if you can listen to the podcast, you hear, hey, you know what? There's a piece of code that might actually be pertinent to me. I need to go patch that because it is absolutely constant. Secondarily, when it comes to open source and when it comes to responsible disclosure, there are absolutely a crap ton of responsibly disclosed packages that are constantly being worked on, responsibly patched across, and I'm going to say across a whole bunch of different companies. So while the company that I work for helps with that process, there are a lot of companies working together to make sure it's patched in every cloud that's out there and different software that's out there, and then rolling that out to where it's going to be disclosed at a certain date and time. And then the patches are live, and then they talk about how and what the issue was. And there are write-ups because of this. Some of the industry has been doing a decent job about writing up what products are or are not affected by this. Others say, hey, we patched something. See ya. See the release notes. And the release notes say patched, random, blah, blah, blah. So there's absolutely responsible disclosure going on all the time in open source. And I'll hand it to whoever else.
Well, so I'm kind of on the enterprise side. I have hundreds, probably thousands of servers now that I support, I run, and I'm in charge of. And if there's a patch out there, I have to download the patch and build an installer for the patch, because not all my servers have access to the internet, and like government contracts and those types of things, I can't always get access to those systems. I also have to QA those patches, and I have to QA those patches across the entire planet. I have sites in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, China. I have places all over the planet that I support. So just because there's a patch for Log4j, does that patch actually impact Unicode? If they fix that, does that break like the Unicode for the characters and stuff? I have to go through and verify all of those, QA test everything, every piece of software that I have before I can deploy that as an enterprise. It becomes a race of, well, it's a risk assessment. One, do I patch blindly because I have to? This is an RCE and my entire network is going to be hacked if I don't patch. Or, hey, all of the devices that could be hacked are not internet accessible. You'd have to physically connect to my network to get to those. I'm going to push those patches out a little bit farther because I have an entire process, and keeping my stores running is more important than patching something that may or may not happen. But it's a risk assessment, and you have to decide.
So
I'm going to hit it beautifully on the head to where you did a risk assessment for your environment. It's not going to be the same for everyone. So I absolutely agree with you, Gulo.
So we are getting way over time. The last little thing I wanted to mention, though, because it came up during me and Gowry's conversation, and it was such an interesting one, which was, I don't know if it's a downfall, if it's a success, but it is something I wanted to just like drop in the room, which is there was a university that wanted to prove out that malicious packages could be inserted in the Linux kernel. Like, this was a downfall of the open source community saying you can inject malicious code. And I don't know what university it was. Hopefully someone can just go ahead and glance at it and throw it in the chat. But they tried to grab malicious code, and they tried to merge it into the Linux kernel to prove out anyone can do this. And then they were banned from working on the Linux kernel moving forward. I don't know what my thoughts are on this, because in one side, it was proven out that they can't do that. But at the same time, it's very easy for any developer to do this. Like, who was a maintainer of the software at a certain point, and I'm, in no way am I saying this with Log4j. It happened like 8 years ago. But there are many packages where it's like there's not that many maintainers, and there is attack paths towards this. But it doesn't matter if it's closed source or open source, this could be done. But what was the university? University of Minnesota banned from open source.
Minnesota.
Thank you, Gator. And then we'll wrap it on up.
So, yeah, they were trying to do this as a thought experiment. They actually did not go through faculty correctly, and it was caught. Long story short, this was an experiment to see if they could just randomly say, hey, open source is so needing, developers will just accept anything. And that wasn't the case. And they kind of got flamed out for it on the kernel patch list as well. The important thing, going back to this, though, would be, hey, there are some people checking some of the steps. It's not everybody who's checking it. And these things do take time. The watering hole attack is named that way because this has been a thing for a very, very long time across any piece of software, whether it's the kernel, whether it's NPM, whether it's Python or anything else. We're all vulnerable all the time, so might as well just pack up shop and everybody disconnect from the internet. No, go ahead.
Gowry, Gulo, do you have any comments on that before we go ahead and wrap
Yeah,
on up?
I mean, this is basically what, like, we say this, week after week. One of the biggest threats to the larger developer community and the internet community is third party packages, and because let's just take the Linux kernel. Let's pretend like the Linux kernel is 100% perfect and they never accept malicious patches and whatever. Every bug is always just a mistake, whatever the case. And then you pull in some other third-party package that is maintained by two people and is needy and wants the quick bug fixes and stuff like that. There's an infinite number of injection points in that case. So even if even if you trust the Linux kernel, as soon as you pull in some other third-party package that maybe quote unquote everyone else is using and quote unquote is the industry standard, maybe they're not as studious, and diligent in reviewing their stuff. So you just don't. It's really, really hard to know, and that's one of the things when you're working on closed source stuff is you at least know who's working on your software. Right. The moment you pull in a third party package, you have to treat every single commit and every person who has ever authored a commit or authored code as one of your developers. Right. You have to, like, if you are so security conscious that you are worried about, injections of bad code and a quote insider threat in that way, you have to treat third party packages exactly that way. And so it becomes this it becomes really difficult to use almost anything without being, like everything is bad. Let's just pack up shop and disconnect from the internet, which is why I joke. I'm just like, computers were a mistake. Let's just, delete computers and return to monkey. For exactly that reason. Like if you're so bogged down in security that you can't trust anything, yeah, you may as well just disconnect from computers entirely.
But this is I was talking about that security is always an overhead. Like it always is. No matter how if you work at an ice cream shop and you do security you work at Haagen-Dazs, your goal is to sell Haagen-Dazs. Like that's all it is. Like you're not to make you want to make a secure website? Great. You want to do security testing? All of that is to sell more ice cream. That's it. It's not to be more secure. It's to sell more ice cream.
Okay, I have to shoot that one down because all of information technology, whether it's security or not, is pretty much a cost center. In some instances, no, but in most instances, your entire information technology department is a cost center.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that.
I do have I have an example of how security fails as well. So I write challenges, and a piece of code that I wrote was to teach people about ADS, alternate data streams. It's a really great way to hack things in Microsoft land. And these ADSs, I wrote a script that creates ADSs, and you had to go find those ADSs and find them and read them, and then you'd submit what was in the ADS to get points. What I did, though, was I wrote the ADS in PowerShell. And the problem with that is people could examine the PowerShell and then go back through and without actually doing the challenge, they could just read the PowerShell. So I downloaded something that converted the PowerShell to an executable, and I posted it on the darknets, on my server for the darknets, and people would download it and run it and figure out what was going on. The problem is there was someone who wrote a patch for, I can't think of the name of those now either. I'm brain dead. I'm sick. Leave me alone.
Sorry.
There was the antivirus companies have what they download, and somebody wrote something saying that anything that is a PowerShell script that is an executable is a virus. And that covered the entire gambit of everything. And pretty much every single antivirus manufacturer was like, hey, yes, we agree with this. If it's a PowerShell script that's converted to an executable, it's a virus. It's malicious code, ban it. So I started getting emails from AWS because I have this PowerShell script as an executable on my website. And they're like, hey, you have a virus. I'm like, this isn't a virus. Like, no, it's totally a virus. Virus Total says it's a virus. It's a virus. You need to remove it. We're going to ban your account. I'm like, no, I wrote this. It's not I know exactly what this is. And I had to go back through and I was like, oh, this is why it's considered a virus. Technically, it's still up. Occasionally, I get an email from AWS and I just have to reference back to a previous ticket number. But it was quicker for me to convert from a PowerShell to an executable rather than me going and writing all of that and compiling it in like C and deploying it. So security is not perfect either. There's a lot of times there's a broad swath of things that they just ban just for the sake of banning things, and it breaks things all over the place.
Yep.
With that, I think we're about 24 minutes past when we ended. We end on time every week.
Every time.
As planned. Oh my goodness. So
9 p.m. on.
What was that? And you
9 p.m. every year.
Every year. Oh goodness. With that, it is so interesting, and there's so much more to talk about for Log4j. Like the other one we didn't even mention was that we talked like a couple weeks ago that Cloudflare has now become like a central point of failure for so much of the internet, like AWS. But how cool was it that they were able to review some of their logs and see they went through the last like 8 years of logs, which is terrifying that they have those, but they went through a ton of the logs, did their SSL termination and looked through like what they actually had available and found Log4j, the exploit, the JNPL, was not used until a week before the disclosure. And that to me is incredible. And what's so funny that it was used a week before the disclosure. Again, they only looked at the traffic going through Cloudflare. I have to imagine that was the guy over at Alibaba who discovered it, like sending it to a buddy, like, you're not going to believe this. Here, let me test it out with you. And it just so happened to go to Cloudflare. Like, that was a pretty interesting one. With that,
let's jump on my Minecraft server, man. Check this
let's
out.
Go around the room with some final thoughts, and we'll get this thing wrapped on up. Going to Gator first.
All right, so I tried not to do any yelling. I tried not to be too passionate, but at the same time, I love open source, man. There are lots of problems with it, but we are empowered to go through and change it. So I want to see you guys actually helping out with this, which is awesome. With that, I got to say I've really enjoyed this, and make sure to go love your hacker family.
Yeah, I've been wanting to do more open source as of recent. Like I've been doing mostly closed source development for close to a decade now. And I'm starting to see that like just how much we are dependent, even if you just consider Linux itself, like how dependent we are on open source and how dependent the entire world is on open source and what that means for, how underfunded a lot of these projects are. And how undermanned a lot of these, underpersoned, under-engineered a lot of these projects are. Yeah, I mean, hop on, join. I think the world only gets better with open source. So as much as I hammer on it and say like it's a risk, it's pretty much the answer to getting it right for the most part. So yeah, that's my sign off. Gulo?
We don't have a work shortage. We have a profitable work shortage. There's tons of things that we can go out and do and fix and patch, but because it's not profitable to do it, we don't do those things. Open source is kind of spitting in the face of that, but it's not perfect. Closed source has its issues. Open source has its issues. If more developers were paid to fix things like Log4j, the open source community would thrive. We don't have a work shortage. We have a profitable work shortage.
That is amazing, and probably the quote for this week. With that, thank you for watching. We're going to be off next week. Have a very Merry Christmas, a happy holiday, a great new year, and as always, hack on.